Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
All right, I want you to take your syllabus, and I'm going to work through the syllabus with you because it really is an effective way to introduce the course. I don't do that so much in other courses, but this is going to be a different kind of a course. Some of you may have been exposed to some of these things. Most of you will not have. Now, look at the course description. This course will introduce the student, that's you, to philosophy through a consideration of various theistic and non-theistic worldviews. Now, for many people, many Christians especially, when you get to the word philosophy, red flags may go up. Philosophy can be a dirty word. And philosophy has been destructive to many people's faith over the years, through the centuries. There are many young people who have come out of Christian homes with sound Christian upbringings, have gone into universities, have taken, introductory philosophy course because it was required or looked interesting, and all of a sudden are faced with these big intellectual questions that they don't know how to handle. And in the process have backed off from their faith, have decided, well, maybe what I was taught all my life isn't true. And so that can be a problem, and there is no question that the study of philosophy from the wrong source and with the wrong perspective and without all of the information that's available about this sort of a thing can be destructive to one's faith. However, as Richard Sisson quotes a professor of his, and he wrote a book some time ago called Training for Evangelism, which was published by Moody Press. He says, I remember a philosophy professor in college who began his lectures by saying, some people do not believe in the study of philosophy. They're being deceived. For philosophy simply involves the way we look at life and how we integrate those data of living into a consistent system. The question is not whether I have a philosophy. The question is rather whether the philosophy that I have is good or bad, consistent or inconsistent. So everybody has an assumed way of looking at life. Now, in actuality, the word philosophy in that quotation would probably better be substituted by the word worldview. A worldview is a kind of a philosophy, and in a lecture or two we will look at the difference between philosophy and worldview. This is not a traditional intro to philosophy course where we are going to study the philosophers and what they think and where they come from. We are going to approach the subject of philosophy rather through sort of the back door, through the idea of worldview. Now that may be as foreign to you in terms of a concept and what that's all about as philosophy is in terms of the formal study of it. But everyone does have a worldview. Everyone has a set of answers to certain fundamental questions that everybody has to make a decision about. And they carry that set of answers and assumptions to those basic issues of life. Who am I, and where did I come from, and where am I going, and what is the nature of this universe that we live in? Everyone has some sort of an answer to all of those questions. And the sum of those answers to the most basic fundamental questions like that make up one's worldview. And philosophy really is nothing more than a consideration of those things from a theoretical side rather than a practical side. So we're going to come at the idea of philosophy from the standpoint of worldview because you all have one. And everyone you run into has one. What we want to do is find out whether the worldviews that we run into are good or bad, whether they are consistent or inconsistent. How consistent your biblical or Christian worldview is. And so this is not a course which is going to challenge your faith in terms of the way a philosophy course may, but it is a course that will allow you to think and interact intelligently in regard to what are often philosophical issues, but in sort of street clothes, in everyday terms. So that's why we have a double title for this: Intro to Philosophy, a Christian Worldview. You are going to read about philosophers. You will read about them particularly in one text that is looking at the issue of worldview from a committedly Christian biblical viewpoint, and talking about how in the course of philosophical thought in the Western world, people have moved away from what used to be a more biblically centered worldview that influenced and permeated Western culture. We will also consider it from the standpoint of a series of videos by Francis Schaeffer. So it is not a traditional philosophy course, but you will get a handle and not feel totally uncomfortable when people start talking about certain philosophical things. So that's how we will be introduced to philosophy, by consideration of various theistic and non-theistic worldviews, giving attention to the historical departure from Christian theism in Western civilization, and focusing on current thinking with respect to worldview options. Coming out of the Middle Ages, through the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, there really was a core theistic belief. At the Renaissance, that all changed, and we will consider that through a film series. You'll be introduced to the concepts of secular humanism, mystical humanism, modernism, postmodernism, with a special emphasis on how these compare and contrast to Christian theism. But we are not going to be spending all of our time looking at the false isms. We really are going to spend most of our time looking at worldview from a Christian standpoint. Because once you really understand what the basic questions are that everybody has assumed answers to, and that you understand what the biblical answer is to it, you really can identify falsehood when you run into it. You really can identify when somebody is coming from a different ideological universe, in the words of James Sire, when you encounter it. And so we will be approaching the course in terms of looking at these contrasting worldviews, these non-biblical worldviews, and philosophical issues, the same way that U.S. Treasury agents are taught to identify counterfeit money. Does anybody know how that's done? How are they taught to identify a counterfeit $20 bill? Yeah, I don't know your name yet, but I will in a couple weeks. Yeah, Daniel, that's right, Linux.
By studying the genuine art.
That's right. They give them the genuine $20 bill, and they make them study that and look at it and become so familiar with it that when they run into the fake, they know it's a fake. Not that they may have seen that before, but they are comparing it to the real thing. And that's how we're going to approach this. We're going to spend the first part of the course looking at Christian theism organized according to these worldview concepts. And once we understand that, once we understand how the Bible answers those fundamental questions of what's the nature of the universe and where did it come from and who are we and so forth, then we're in a position to know when a worldview is departing significantly or in a small manner from what the Bible says. So this will be a Bible course in the fundamental aspect of it. But we will see how it relates to these questions, because we don't live in an insulated world. One of the books that we're going to be using is entitled The Universe Next Door. And it is titled because whereas 50 years ago in this community, in this nation, you lived next door to people who were at least nominally Christians, almost exclusively. And you may run into, in large cosmopolitan areas, people who are Hindus or atheists or something else, but generally, your neighbors weren't that. But now, even in a place as small as Dubuque may be big for some of you, it's small for many of you, you're going to run into all kinds of different ideological positions and ideological universes. And if you want to be able to interact with your culture, with your society, if you want to be able to share Christ effectively, it really is necessary that we at least appreciate how people think. We're not going to agree with them, but we need to know how to bridge this ideological universe gap. And so that will be the emphasis on our course. Attention will be given to how the underlying presuppositions of these ways of viewing reality affects one's ability to think and evaluate his or her world, and how presuppositions relate to morality and ethics. We have a certain assumed set of beliefs, and those beliefs should affect all of our life, but sometimes they don't. We'll explore how looking at life from a worldview standpoint, and that's not how we have to look at it to get truth, but it can help us in terms of seeing how consistently we are living a biblical worldview. And so there are a number of personal and practical things that will come out of this course as we look at this material. Okay, let's look at the course objectives. I've mentioned them all in some way. You're going to become aware of the concept and the necessity for personal development in the area of critical thinking. The second objective, you'll be able to define the concept of worldview, to articulate the particulars of the worldview of Christian theism, be able to state the presuppositions of naturalism, identify them when encountered in various worldview writings and presentations, be able to identify worldview presuppositions upon which various ethical and moral decisions are based. There is a direct relationship between a person's belief system and a person's value system, and therefore actions. And we will explore that a bit in regard to ourselves and in regard to those in other worldviews. You'll have a greater appreciation for the unity and the significance of the cosmos. The study of our universe is not an insignificant thing. However, the problem is, most of the time as Christians, we simply get embroiled in the arguments of evolution versus creationism. But there are some more significant elements than that in terms of how the universe that's created and why it was created and how we relate to that creation. They are really, really significant. And studying the Christian truth from a worldview perspective will increase our appreciation of that. You will be able to relate more effectively with those who do not share your Christian worldview, and you'll be able to make moral and ethical judgments that are more consistent with your worldview. Again, we have the Word. The Word directs us. This is just another way to maybe say, I'm not sure I'm really being consistent here out of what I believe. And we will see how that works. I'd like you to take a look at your course materials on page 2. I want to talk about these, and this will explain also how the course will proceed. The first is the book, The Universe Next Door, a basic worldview catalog. This is the 5th edition, and you must use the 5th edition. There may still be some 4th editions floating around the school, but it has significant changes. The assignment that you will do out of it dictates that you must use this book. The Universe Next Door, I actually started using the 3rd edition back in the 1980s when I was developing a course like this at a one-year Bible school in Canada, and have really benefited from his way to look at this issue of worldview. This will not be easy reading. Some of you, it will be very challenging reading, but you will benefit from it. Just slog through it, okay? Read it. You will have questions to answer on every chapter. but it will be important because it will help to give you a foundation as to how the different ideas in our what we've inherited in terms of the ideas floating in our communities, but now they're from everywhere in the world. I have a personal example of how the material you'll find in this book will be helpful. When the Star Wars movies first were coming out, I don't remember, what was the date of the first one? Most of you weren't alive. Probably late 70s. 78. And, I'd been to seminary. I was out of seminary. I was, working in a church, preaching and teaching. And these came out, and, they were entertaining. I remember, taking my kids to them. Made a mistake. The first one we went to the drive-in, a movie, and they're too dark to enjoy the drive-in theater. Anyway, outside. Anyway, they came out. Finally, you get to the third one, and Luke Skywalker is in the struggle with his father, who's Darth Vader, and instead of giving into his hatred, he lays that aside and allows himself to be almost destroyed. And I thought, that's really great. There's a biblical picture, or a picture of the biblical truth of good overcoming evil. And in the end, he redeems his father, saves his father out of the darkness through this self-sacrificing love. Well, that's not what was at the heart of the movie at all. But I had no idea about the Eastern mysticism that was at work in this movie in terms of the light side and the dark side and the Force and so forth. Because I had just never been introduced to those thought categories. So I took out of it, what I wanted. I brought in my Christian theology and I made them fit. Well, they don't. They really don't. Now, that's not to say that Star Wars is totally consistent, because you have this fight between good and evil, which really isn't between two different things, but it looks like it's between two different things, but it's all part of the one Force. And it wasn't until I started reading James Sire that I realized what was really being portrayed in that movie. And then when I back and looked at it, then when I looked at all these discussions about, the Force is that within you, you control it, but it controls you, and blah, 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 and the scenes where Obi-Wan Kenobi is talking to Luke, and he's instructing him on how to be a Jedi and so forth, I just thought, oh, man, it's so obvious. It's so obvious. And so, this will awaken us to really understanding why people are embracing life in the way they are. It's because of their conceptual system. That's where they're coming from. So that's the first book, first resource we will use. We're also going to use a book called Hidden Worldviews, 8 Cultural Stories That Shape Our Lives. And this looks at it from a little different standpoint. These are big, dominating ideas that pervade our culture here in the West, that sort of take us by surprise and grab a hold of us and maybe start putting us into their mold without even realizing it, as Christians. And so this is really sort of a book in which your life will be poured through the filter of these ideas. And they are individualism, consumerism, nationalism, moral relativism, scientific naturalism. And so it's looking from a very practical, applicational standpoint at this idea of worldview and how certain ideas can come to so dominate our thinking that our behavior begins to be molded to it, and even our belief system. And as Christians, we're not immune to this. Again, it's written by Christians from a Christian standpoint. The third resource is called Hollywood Worldviews. This is the updated and expanded edition. It's written by Brian Godawa, who is a Christian film writer. Now, you'd think I didn't know such a thing existed outside of, Christian films. But he is a committed Christian, but he moves in the realm of the media and of movies. And this book explores how worldview is captured and promoted through the media of movies. Now, it's not to get you watching movies. The book is not to get you to watching movies you shouldn't watch. And he's going to deal with that. He's going to deal with, why we do things, why we watch things, the kinds of impacts. But because this is such a pervasive part of our culture, movie media, I think it's worth exposing you to this. We will talk more about it as you begin to read in this and put it into perspective as to how this can be helpful. So those are the resources for the course. I will fill in some of the details as we go along as to how to handle each of those things.